Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. On today's show, I talk about nature, citizen science, monarch butterflies, and more with the new director of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, Karen Oberhauser. Oberhauser studied natural science education at UW-Madison and biology at Harvard University before receiving a doctorate in ecology and behavioral biology from the University of Minnesota. She is perhaps best known for her research on monarch butterflies. She serves as director of the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project and co-chairs the steering committee of the Monarch Joint Venture, a collaborative effort that promotes the long-term sustainability of healthy monarch populations by focusing on conservation efforts within the United States. She also has a strong interest in fostering science-based inquiry in primary education and promoting citizen science and environmental literacy. I dropped by the Arboretum's Visitor Center to interview Oberhauser and started by asking her about the natural area's connection to famed Wisconsin conservationalist Aldo Leopold. You know, what's it like holding the same job that Aldo Leopold once held?
It's humbling. I really do feel the legacy here. I kind of feel that I'm one in a long chain of leaders of the Arboretum. So there are a lot of really amazing people that came before me, and my job is to build on what they've done and also to build a foundation for the people that come after me. So there have been a lot of amazing directors, and I'm sure there will be a lot of amazing directors after me. So it's great to feel a part of the legacy of something so big and so important.
Is Aldo Leopold somebody that you've read, you've looked up to? I mean, it's pretty cool. I mean, there's a weekend coming up, Aldo Leopold. I know there's some events here at the Arboretum. Is that somebody that you've admired?
Of course. It's interesting because I think Aldo Leopold is kind of a part of the blood of everyone who's interested in conservation. So I read the Sand County Almanac for the first time, I don't remember, in high school maybe, or college at some point early on, a long time ago. And it's something that I return to, think about. I use his readings a lot in courses that I teach, both for undergraduates and graduate students and also teachers. So it is pretty amazing to think of his role in the very beginning of the Arboretum, and to think that when he was involved in the beginning of the Arboretum was basically the same time that he was starting to kind of build the foundation for Sand County Almanac and everything that he did at the shack. So really what he was doing here was happening at the same time as all of the rest of that. So that's actually a really exciting feeling to be that I'm not only in the place where he worked, but he was working here when he was doing all of those other amazing things.
You were mentioning just previously before we started talking that you spent a lot of time in Minnesota, 30 years. Why make a jump? Why come here? What interested you about taking on this job at the Arboretum?
Well, this job really combined all of the things I was doing in my previous job. So I was a professor. I taught courses for undergraduates, but I was also very involved in outreach and education. So I had developed a big program focused on monarch butterflies and citizen science, and at the end, insect ecology broadly. So I developed a course for teachers and did a lot of work with K-12 students. So that's a big part of the mission of the Arboretum. I've been a researcher my whole career. That's what I'm trained to do. And research is a big part of the mission of the Arboretum, but also land maintenance and land care. So that's something I have less personal training and experience with, but it's something that's so important to conservation. So as the study species, I've studied monarch butterflies my whole career. And as monarch butterfly numbers declined, and I got very involved in big picture policy for monarchs, I realized that to conserve species, we need to do more than just conserve the habitat that's left. We have to do a good job at restoring habitat. So I'm very interested from a conservation perspective in the work that really had its foundation at the Arboretum. So this job just seemed a perfect confluence of all of the other things that I'd done during my career. So it was, when I saw the opening, I just thought it would be amazing to be able to do this job. So I'm really excited to be here.
I think you did some undergraduate work here at the UW. Did you spend a lot of time in the Arboretum at that time?
I didn't. I was here. I was just here for a year. So I came here to get certified to teach high school. And so I was really busy taking classes. And then I did an internship teaching in Beaver Dam. So I really wasn't in Madison for all that long. And I was pretty focused on getting certified to teach. So if I did come to the Arboretum during that time, I'm ashamed to say that I don't remember coming. But I certainly came after that because I have a lot of family in the area. So probably, in the last 20 years, I've been here several times, but I don't remember being here as a student.
So you kind of started professionally as a teacher, right? That was kind of like when high school biology, I think, that you were doing. How has that informed the entirety of your career, even as a researcher and some of the other things that you've done?
Well, I think when I first taught, I was very young, as most teachers are, and it was an overwhelming job. And I liked teaching, but I loved biology. So I kind of made the decision after doing it for 3 years that I wanted to be doing biology, to be doing research and learning, firsthand the things that were in the textbooks and kind of contributing to the body of scientific knowledge. So I kept, after leaving high school teaching, I kept that connection and interest in education. But I think as my career started to engage more and more K-12 teachers, and I really learned from them and met the teachers who were the teachers doing all of these professional development opportunities were just amazing teachers, just so skilled. And I learned probably more from them that made me a better college teacher than I did from my own experience as a high school teacher. So in all of my classes, I used a lot of techniques that I learned from these teachers. And I often think that if I had those kinds of experiences with teachers before I left the teaching profession, I might have stayed in it just because, they're just so many amazing teachers out there. And I think the problem is that a lot of new teachers are so overwhelmed at what's going on in their own classrooms, and they don't really have the opportunity to learn from all the amazing master teachers out there. So I kind of regret the fact that I didn't have those experiences when I was a teacher, but hopefully I've helped them some as much as they've helped me in my classroom.
And eventually you said you wanted to be doing biology. You wanted to get into doing the research. What was kind of your path from being a teacher and making that decision and then kind of getting into researching? What was the path that took you to kind of where you are now?
I loved research from the get-go. So I probably didn't have, especially when I was in high school and college, students weren't given a lot of opportunities to do independent research. I think that's a more important part of science pedagogy now, is that we really teach students about the process of science along with all of the content of science, but that really wasn't the case when I was in school. So I remember taking a research course when I was a teacher. I went to the Lake Itasca Field Station, which is part of the University of Minnesota, and took a course where we got to do a lot of independent research projects. And I still love the process of being the first person to learn something. I mean, when you're a researcher, there's you're asking new questions or maybe new twists on old questions. And for a little while, when you first learn something new, you're the only person in the world that knows it. And that's really exciting. I love working with data. So I love, sitting there and making some graphs and doing some calculations and thinking, whoa, here's the answer to this question. So there's this little bit of time when no one else in the world knows that. So I've just that process of discovery and that process of looking at the world and seeing questions and then figuring out ways to answer those questions has just always fascinated me, and it always will. So here we're learning new things, and I get to work with a lot of researchers. Even though I'm not so much involved in my own research anymore, I still can do it vicariously and still kind of have that excitement of discovery.
I think I read in a profile of you at some point, maybe years ago, that you played a game with your daughter, and that you kept like kind of the data from that, and you did some research on the data of playing this game with your daughter. Is that a true story?
Yeah. So I'm kind of remembering. Yeah, we played backgammon,
Okay.
and we played for a long, long time, and we kept a score sheet, and she was always about 13 to 20 games ahead of me in the score sheet. But after many years, we had hundreds of games, so we did a statistical calculation called a chi-square, where you figure out if two proportions are actually different from each other. So I said to her, Amy, can you figure out if you're really better than me at backgammon, or if it's just kind of random and you just happen to have won more games? So, right, we did that calculation, did a chi-square test with our real data.
What did your daughter think about that at the time?
She laughed. Both of my daughters laughed a lot at how we pulled science into everything, but it turned out that she really wasn't better than me. It was just random chance that she had won more games.
What do your daughters do now?
One of them is she got a PhD from the University of Wisconsin and is working for the Driftless Area Land Conservancy, helping landowners figure out how to manage their land and figuring out which land should be brought into land trusts and put conservation easements put on them. And my other daughter is in Japan in the Navy. So they're doing very different things, but it's really great to watch both of them kind of make their way in the world.
Why are places like the Arboretum important? It's not a huge tract of land. I mean, it's big, but it's not like just a wide stretch of land. Why is it important to preserve places like this? Why is that important?
How much time do you have? So that's a really good question. There's so many ways to answer that, because the Arboretum is a lot of different things to different people. And I think that for a lot of people, the Arboretum is beneficial because it just provides them a respite from the city. So that's important. I mean, there are a lot of data on how important it is for us to be able to get out of the hustle and bustle and be in a place that's quiet and natural and beautiful. So it's important that we have places like this that are accessible to people, and having them in cities instead of a long ways out of cities makes them more accessible. And while we can never have as huge a tract of land in a city as we can outside of the city, more people can come when it's in a city. So that's one reason. And another reason is that even though we're in some cases preserving little tiny bits and pieces of land, all of these pieces of land contain representations to more or less accurate degrees of what the world used to look like. And to have this piece of land that represents what was here before so many humans came means that future generations will have this as a resource that they can use in restoration, in understanding how the world works. I mean, we really don't know the uses to which this land will be put in the future. We can only know how we're using it now. But saving as many pieces of land as we can is always going to be beneficial. And I think another reason, we do have remnant habitats. We have native habitats that weren't plowed at the Arboretum. So we're protecting that. We also have several 500 acres total of outlying properties, and those almost all are remnants. So we are protecting pieces of land that haven't been modified a lot. Certainly they're modified by what's around them and invasive species, but they provide as close as we can come to a true representation of how the world used to look. I think that the Arboretum itself, as an example of a natural landscape in a city, is an important place to learn how we can manage land that has a lot of human impacts. We have the noise and stormwater runoff and invasive species and a lot of human traffic. So all of these things happening in an area where research is going on, it means that we're helping to inform other managers of city land. So I like to say that we have city problems, but we're developing city solutions. So I think that's important, having pieces of land like this in a city. So those are some of the reasons, and there are many more, but I see you have a long list of other questions. But, if you'd like to talk more about that, we could.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that just crosses my mind, just because it happened to me today, is, there's various wildlife that exists here, and you're within a city. Just speaking specifically of turkeys, like this morning I saw a turkey. I don't live far away. He was, he or she was outside my apartment, a couple blocks away from the Arboretum. And as I was coming here, there was a couple across Monroe Street, in the kind of the urban area. What are some of the considerations you have to make as far as wildlife and kind of the drift of in and out of residential areas and city areas with wildlife? Do you have to manage those populations? What are some of those considerations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we have a lot of turkeys here, and the fact that the Arboretum is here, and providing this safe habitat for the turkeys probably means they do spill out into neighboring properties, and it's possible to get too many turkeys in an area. So that's an example of how we try to be really cognizant of the impact that the organisms will have on our neighbors, educating people about, you're going to probably see more turkeys if you live near the Arboretum. And, we don't have too many complaints about those. And I think the Arboretum also provides a place where we have this haven in an area that's accessible to people. So, often people think of turkeys and coyotes and foxes as wildlife, but we also have a lot of really beneficial organisms here, like insects that are pollinators. So there's a lot of benefit we provide for the surrounding area in terms of the organisms that have whose populations can build up here. Our neighbors probably see a lot of songbirds, migrating songbirds, because they have this haven here. So there might be some negative spillover, but I think for the most part, the fact that we are an area that's provides habitat for a lot of organisms probably means that it has a lot more benefits to our neighbors than negatives.
Yeah, and for the record, I don't mind seeing turkeys outside. I also see a couple of sandhill cranes that I think live here in the summer. They live in one of the ponds or sleep in one of the ponds. They're always over by my apartment as well, and I love seeing them. So I don't mind that at all. What are some of the other animals that you kind of keep track of here at the Arboretum? You mentioned insects. I'm guessing bees are something that is studied here. But what are some of the other kind of interesting features, whether it's plants or animals or insects?
Well, certainly the insects. I've been an insect ecologist my whole career, so I'm pretty excited about the insects. There's the first bumblebee to be listed as endangered. The rusty patch bumblebee is not overly common here, but we certainly see it fairly often. So we're monitoring that because it's a federally listed species now. There are people at the University of Wisconsin who are interested in monitoring urban canids or dogs and animals in the dog family, relationships between coyotes and foxes. So that is a research project that's going on at the Arboretum. We're monitoring impacts of, or we're thinking of even more than we are now, increasing monitoring of deer populations because we are a haven for white-tailed deer. So that's a species that we're looking at. We don't have a study going on right now of turkeys, but that would be an interesting one. We're also monitoring some pretty interesting from a scientific perspective, but kind of sad from a conservation perspective, invasive species. There's a fairly new to Wisconsin worm, it's called an Asian jumping worm, that was first found at the Arboretum, and then it's pretty much once we started knowing it was here and developing Arboretum staff, working with UW staff, faculty and students, developed a monitoring protocol for these worms. And so we've been able to actually document the spread of these jumping worms through the Arboretum and are looking at the impacts of them and then kind of putting that on top of how they're spreading through the whole state of Wisconsin. So we're really monitoring the good, bad, and the ugly as we kind of figure out what organisms are here, what impacts they might have, positive and negative, on the habitat, and how they're using our habitat and other areas.
And I know you brought this before, monarch butterflies is something you've kind of studied throughout your life. Are you going to bring some of that research here? Are you going to continue doing some of that research here at the Arboretum? Because I do see a lot of monarchs around here. Is that something that you're going to continue while you're working here?
Yeah. Like I said before, I won't have as much time to do research anymore, but definitely I've been involved in citizen science or engaging citizens in my research for a long time. And about 25 years ago now, a graduate student and I developed a program called the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which is a program that engages people in looking at densities of monarch eggs and caterpillars on milkweed plants in their yards or road ditches or wherever they want to look. So we've already started doing that at the Arboretum. I'll be working with some colleagues on research looking at diseases that monarchs have, and we'll be doing some of that here at the Arboretum. So we're working on fitting monarchs into a whole suite of citizen science projects that we'll be kind of featuring at the Arb, looking at bees, worms, dragonflies, and monarchs. So it'll become kind of a part of our programming. And it's certainly something we have books in the bookstore about monarchs and T-shirts. So certainly it is something that I'm bringing.
Why is it important to research and to monitor these insects? What do they tell us about the larger story of what's going on in the environment?
There are a lot of different ways we can answer that. So either we can monitor, for example, monarchs. Monarchs are really interesting in their own right. They're an amazing species because they undergo this great migration, and they have just incredible biology for many reasons. But one of the reasons we even can monitor them is because people are so interested in them, and we have fairly good methods worked out for counting them or for assessing the status of the population. And there are a lot of insects for which we just can't do that. They're more difficult to observe. They're in places where people don't go very often, or there's just many reasons that insects are just notoriously difficult to count. So monarchs and bumblebees are another example. They're pretty easily recognized. They can provide kind of a picture of how an ecosystem is going. And they also provide, when we get people engaged in looking at monarchs or bumblebees or whatever species it is that they're interested in, they get involved in understanding the kind of habitat that those species like. So it both kind of gives us, kind of lets us feel the pulse of a lot of different species by tracking the ones that we can track. But it has also the effect of engaging people and getting people interested in habitat conservation. So I'm a big proponent of monitoring whatever we can monitor. Whatever is possible to accurately assess, we should be doing it, because the more data we have, the more we understand how these populations are doing, the better able we'll be to help them down the line. So I just think we should be monitoring the heck out of the world and just, really, really knowing what's going on as best we can.
I read that you've been monitoring or researching monarchs since like the 80s, since the mid 80s. Why monarchs? I mean, why did you settle on that as something that you wanted to work on throughout your career?
Yeah, so the reasons for that have really changed. When I first started studying monarchs, I was interested in a really esoteric question. I was interested in parental investment in offspring. So I wanted to study a species where I could quantify both maternal investment, so what comes from the mother, and paternal investment. And I thought of studying birds because a female produces the egg, but you can watch a nest and see how much the male invests in creating the nest, sitting on the eggs, bringing food to the hatchlings. So I wanted to study a species where I could quantify and compare maternal and paternal investment. And it turns out that you can quantify paternal investment in butterflies because the males transfer, when they're mating, the males transfer material to the female in addition to sperm. And it's material that the female actually can use. She metabolizes it and can use it in her own body tissues and in the eggs. So I could measure this. So I wanted to study something I could quantify and measure. So I decided to study butterflies because of this interesting setup that they have with this material transfer. And somebody just said, kind of in an offhand comment, well, you should study monarchs because it's very easy to get them to mate in captivity. It's easy to rear them. You can do big experiments and answer the questions that you have. So I started studying them purely for a practical reason. And that's what I focused on in graduate school and in the beginning of my career as an independent researcher. But then at the same time, I was starting my research on monarchs with this very focused, narrow question. A couple things happened. I became a professor and started having graduate students, and people were interested in monarchs. So I had people coming and working with me because they wanted to study many different questions about monarchs. So the research of my lab at the University of Minnesota kind of broadened. So we studied many, many aspects of monarch biology, from migration to caterpillar growth and development to overwintering in Mexico, just everything. We studied so many different things, diseases. And then while that was happening, while my research was kind of broadening out to many aspects of the organism's biology, the population was declining. So, and I saw that happen. I mean, I started studying monarchs in Mexico and if you see graphs of monarchs in Mexico, there was one really high year in 1996. And that was the first year I went to Mexico. And so I saw it at its very peak, and then I saw it decline. And so then my research kind of shifted from being broad about many, many aspects of their biology to really being very focused on conservation and what we need to do to conserve monarchs. So I went from a very narrow, not very important question in the big picture of conservation to broad focus on lots of things to being more narrowly focused on conservation.
And you did mention just kind of a remarkable insect in that migration. And you said you've been to Mexico where they winter, kind of where they end up in these big groves of just thousands of them. They're remarkable. It's remarkable to be in one of those groves where they're just kind of clustered. And do you remember the first time that you set foot in one of those and what that experience was like?
Yeah, I remember it very, very well. It's like a high point in my mind. First of all, it's not thousands, it's millions. So overwintering monarchs in Mexico are the second densest concentration of animals in the world. The first densest concentration is krill in the Antarctic Ocean. So it is beyond explanation. I mean, it's just the most amazing thing. You can smell it and hear it and feel it. So it's a little bit like if you've ever been scuba diving or snorkeling and being surrounded by fish in all dimensions. That's what it's like. And it's very high in the mountains. So the first time I went there, I was coming from low Minnesota, and I was at a high elevation, and I'd been traveling a lot, so I was kind of out of breath and hiked for probably an hour and a half to get to this site up high on the mountain. So I was kind of exhausted when I got up there. And I was walking with some colleagues from Mexico, and I started seeing a few monarchs kind of flying around, and I thought, oh, good, here I am. It's February, and I'm seeing monarchs. But then they just stopped and said, look up. And I was just so blown away, because when the monarchs are sitting in the trees, their wings are closed. So you see the ventral side of their wings, the underside of their wings, which is not really bright orange. It's kind of a dull brownish orange color. And in the trees, they're not that, you don't see them really at first. So they just kind of look like part of the tree. So I literally burst into tears when I saw it. So it was kind of a combination of that long walk up the mountain and being so surprised at seeing a few flying where they were very visible, and then seeing all of them in the trees. It was kind of beyond words.
I always find it interesting when I tell people that, or like I just have a conversation with people, like people don't believe that they migrate across like the entire country, or that they end up in these just massive clusters. They don't have any concept. It's a well-known butterfly, but a lot of people don't. Do you find that a lot of people don't have like the full story of them?
Yeah, I think a lot of people know they migrate. Barbara Kingsolver's book, Flight Behavior, did a lot to kind of educate people, because a lot of people read that book. But you're right. It's really quite amazing. A monarch butterfly weighs as much as a paperclip. And to think that they can fly all that far. And I think, many people have heard of the fact that monarchs overwinter in Mexico, but very often they don't know that it's the same butterfly. A butterfly can leave Madison, Wisconsin, and fly a couple thousand miles to get to these overwintering sites in Mexico. And that's a straight line, and they probably don't take a straight line. We don't know really how far they go to get there, and then live the whole winter there. So it's just, whenever I'm in Mexico and look up at all of those butterflies, I just think of the stories. Each one of them is an amazing story. So it's, the sheer numbers and the masses and the concentrations of them are amazing. But really what's most amazing is all of those individual stories that make up the masses. So it's kind of an unbelievable feat. And what's cool about it from a scientific perspective is, despite the fact that people have been studying monarchs for a long time, and they have this really interesting behavior that we've kind of worked out the big picture details, we don't know any of the little details. We don't know how they find those sites year after year, and how they go to the same sites, and how butterflies starting out in Madison can end up in the same place that a butterfly starting out in Bangor, Maine. So it's just kind of it's an amazing story. And I love it that there's this big question that so many people are interested in that we haven't quite answered yet. That's exciting for a scientist, that there's still these big questions that you'd think people would know the answers to.
I saw that you were honored by the White House in 2013 for in part for some of your work regarding monarchs and some of the programs you've been involved in. What was that experience like for you? How did you learn that you were going to be honored, and kind of what was the whole thing?
Well, first of all, it was kind of a funny thing because I was in the shower or something, and my husband the phone rang, and I said, "Can you get that?" And he answered it, and he shouted upstairs. He said, "Karen, it's the White House," which is kind of like a joke. So that was exciting to know that. I mean, it was humbling and exciting because I'd been nominated by a lot of my colleagues. It was a program. It was several people, so it wasn't just me. It was several, like 6 or 7 of us who had been involved with citizen science who got honored, and it was in this program that the Obama administration had called the Champions of Change. So he brought people that were a force for positive change. So yeah, it was just amazing. And I didn't know about it. And a lot of people, they invited the people that had nominated me there. So I didn't know they were coming. So I was sitting up at this table in the front of the room, and people that I knew kept coming into the room. And so it was just, really a neat experience. It was fun.
And not to go from a high point to a low point, but today maybe in the last few years, there's been kind of this rejection of science, or there's been kind of like defunding of science or public lands or whatever it is. And there's just like science seems to be like a very political thing for some reason. What do you make of science in the public discourse in the world of politics right now?
I think as an educator, it's something I think about a lot. And I think about how do we talk about science so that people can understand it? How do we kind of explain and teach about the difference between facts and opinions? How do we communicate about scientific uncertainty? I think that's something that scientists don't do very well. So it's important for us to educate people, to understand the reasons that people are sometimes distrustful of science. And, I think we just as scientists need to keep plugging away at this. And I actually, there are a lot of things I don't understand about the current distrust of science. And it's something, that it does seem to have a political, like when you read that people's understanding of or belief in, something like climate change has one political party is more likely to feel one way and another political party is more likely to feel another way. I kind of shake my head in wonderment about that. But I think part of it is we maybe just need to really do a better job at communicating our science. And then we need to do a better job as citizens at being skeptical. And I think that's something really interesting to think about, that how do we teach people not to believe everything they hear and to be able to understand evidence and what is evidence. Yeah, I think if I had a good answer to your question, the world, if a lot of people are looking for that answer, and I think we just kind of need to keep trying the best we can to communicate well.
If you were to find yourself back in that classroom that you started out in, teaching, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, people who are about ready to go into the world as a citizen and as a voter. I guess, how would you approach it now, knowing we're in that kind of environment? Would you do it differently? How would you kind of approach that situation as a teacher?
I think that's a great question. And I think the teachers really work on this now. I think it's an important part of at least the science curriculum, and I think other curricula as well, that we are really trying to teach students about evaluating evidence. And I think that is so important. And I would spend a lot of time on that, because so much more than when I was teaching high school, students have the world at their fingertips, and they have a lot of bad information. There's a lot out there that they can read that is incorrect. So I think we need to understand how to evaluate information. So one of the things that I think a lot about, and when I was teaching conservation biology to undergraduates, I'm not a climate scientist, and I don't understand all of the climate models. Those are very, very complicated models. And I know enough to kind of read the papers and have a basic understanding of what's going on. But I do trust the process of science, and I trust scientific consensus. So when people have evaluated data, I understand how to evaluate data. So I think that's something that there can be uncertainty. We don't know, for example, keeping going with the climate change example, we don't know exactly what the impacts of cloud cover will be on, the details of climate. So there are a lot of questions, but we do know the basics of science. We do know how carbon dioxide acts to trap in the sun's energy. So that's documented. We understand that science, and there are details we don't understand. So I think teaching students to kind of be able to evaluate the big picture, to trust in the process of science, to understand when there's uncertainty, what that means, and to be able to kind of come up with their own conclusions, but knowing that we can't all understand everything, so that if we kind of help people understand how scientific information is gleaned from the world, then I think people will have more trust in the process.
Since you're speaking to a guy that's been a journalist, a newspaper reporter in his life, do you have any advice for how journalists and people in the media can do a better job of communicating science as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think about it a lot. When I first started thinking about that so much, I was involved in some research on genetically modified organisms. So I went to all of these meetings and places where there were a lot of journalists and talked to a lot of journalists. And one of the things I learned is that journalists feel compelled, for good reasons, to present both sides of a story. But often we as readers are presented with both sides of a story in something we may not know a lot about, as if they're equally valid. And there often isn't the perspective included that, the vast majority of scientific thought is on this side of the story, but there are some people that aren't. And so I think that the way that we're presented with these kind of opposing dichotomous views, sometimes I think journalists do a little bit of a disservice by feeling the need to present everything. And then I think to some readers, it comes across as scientists don't agree on this, so, I can just kind of choose one side or the other because there's this disagreement. When often there is scientific, if not consensus, a strong preponderance of evidence in one direction. So, yeah, that might be advice I have. It's hard, though.
When I told a friend of mine that I was going to come talk to a monarch expert, he wanted to know, he's planting milkweed in his yard, trying to make it hospitable for monarchs and just help out the population of monarchs. Is there anything else that he can do, that people can do to make their homes, their area around their homes, more presentable for monarchs or maybe other insects as well?
Yeah, I think one thing, they should get rid of lawns. A lawn is basically a monoculture of a non-native plant. Most of our lawns are Kentucky bluegrass, which isn't a native plant around here. So lawns have very shallow root structure. They aren't really doing a lot for the soil. We mow all the nutrients off them, and the water can't really infiltrate very well because it's such the ground is covered so densely with blades of grass that it just runs off. I've heard it called green concrete. So lawns are not great for a lot of reasons. So replacing lawns with native plants are always great, are always a good option. And having a mixture of species of flowers, host plants for insects means you're going to have lots of insect species. You're going to have birds that'll come to eat those insects. So the things I would say are diversity, having lots and lots of as many different species of native plants as possible. They'll do the best. The native plants will do the best because they're evolved for these conditions. And minimizing pesticide use because, we're kind of used to thinking that insects are our enemies when it comes to a garden, but really you can tolerate a few chewed on leaves and it's all going to turn out okay in the end. So diverse native plants is what I would suggest.
All right.
And not much grass.
Not much grass. So I know we were kind of talking a little bit about citizen science research, and that's been important in what you've done. I'm just kind of curious, have you seen the importance of citizen science grow in maybe the last 10 years? I mean, has it been something that's kind of taken off since you kind of started your career?
Definitely. Interesting to watch that happen because I kind of got in on the ground floor of that growth. Certainly there are very old citizen science programs dating back a century. The people have been collecting data and scientists have been analyzing those data to figure out patterns in the natural world. But I think a lot of things happen to make citizen science really explode. It's been exponential growth. And one is the internet. So we can now collect data so people can learn about projects very easily. They can get the instructions for how to participate in projects easily. They can enter their data. They don't have to mail hard copies of their data. The data can be easily accessed by whoever would need them for analyses. So I think it's made it possible to engage a broad public in science is all of the tools we have now that we didn't have a couple decades ago. And I think another thing that's happened is scientists are becoming much more accepting of citizen science data. So when I first started publishing papers using data collected by citizens, I'd always have to have this big, long justification in the beginning of the paper of why it was valid to use data collected by people who were teachers or postal deliverers or journalists. Why is that okay? And so there's always this big song and dance about that, proving that it was really okay. And that really has changed. So I don't feel like I have to do that anymore when I'm writing a paper using citizen science data. And then I think we kind of are, in many cases, becoming a more participatory society, and that's great. So I think that people are excited about learning that way, about learning about species by collecting data on them, and they're excited about contributing to knowledge. So I think it just kind of, all of these things happened at once, and now it's just a snowball that, so many. I've been trying to find other people at the University of Wisconsin who are involved in citizen science in different ways, and I just keep finding more and more people. There are just a lot of us here, and I think that would be true of any university, which is a great sign.
What is your hope for the future of it? I mean, it just seems like it's going to grow and grow and grow as more people get interested and more people become accepting of that data. Obviously, things like artificial intelligence are coming out. So, like, computing power is just getting being able to go through this kind of data. What do you hope citizen science can accomplish? In the next 10 years, where is this all headed?
Well, I think it'll continue to grow. I think that we will find new ways to engage the public in scientific research. And you mentioned artificial intelligence. There's really interesting sort of almost collaboration between artificial intelligence platforms and citizen science. In a lot of cases, there's this great program called Zooniverse, which is a program where there are many, many different Zooniverse projects, but it's basically image identification.
Mm-hmm. I've clicked on a lot of penguins.
Okay.
I've done this. So.
Yeah, so the Snapshot Wisconsin is another example. Right, so you've done Zooniverse programs. Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting about that is there's a lot of research being done based on your penguin clicking and then trying to train computers to recognize penguins. There's really interesting, we're learning a lot of things about how people's brains work and how we can train how we can train machines in image recognition. So I think citizen science, it's becoming more accepted. We can get a lot more done engaging citizens in all sorts of different projects. So it's going to help the scientific academy grow. We'll learn more about the natural world, but also we'll learn more about how people's brains work and how artificial intelligence works and what motivates people to volunteer. So this is volunteering. When you click those penguins, you're giving your time and, you're helping researchers with all sorts of questions. So, people are doing research on what motivates you to do that and what you get out of it. So we learn there's a lot of social science involved. So I think that, and people are getting more interested in science. So I think citizen science really is a way that we might address these problems that we were talking about a couple minutes ago about science and scientists not being trusted so much. If people are scientists, I think we might start to solve that problem. So I'm really excited about it. It has been so much fun to watch this field grow and go in directions that none of us could have anticipated a couple decades ago.
What do you think is the future of places like this that we're at right now, the Arboretum? How important are places like this to the future? Do you feel like the mission of these places will change at all, or is it going to remain constant over the next 100 years?
The answer to that question is it'll remain constant and it'll change. Well, I think it's in our being that we are attracted to natural places and we feel peaceful and calm. That's like part of our DNA. And I think that that's not going to change. Hopefully it won't change, that, people will still gain respite and there will always be a need for scientific research. The natural world is so complex and so in some ways hard to study that we're never going to answer all of the questions. So we will keep needing these places. It's sometimes easy to get discouraged about conservation work. We sometimes feel that there are just all of these pressures of climate change and invasive species and pollution. And then one of the things that is relevant to how the world might change in the future is that we will have more tools. So when I was talking about how it feels to be part of this legacy at the Arboretum, there's all these smart people that came before us, those of us who are here now managing this land, and we're doing the best we can, and we have more tools. We know more about restoration. We know more about species relationships. So we're using the tools that are available to us now. So in some ways we can do a better job because we know more. But as a scientist, I'm confident that the information that we're learning now and the information that will be learned by future generations of scientists will continue to help us do a good job managing land like the Arboretum. So in a sense, we're just sort of scientific caretakers, building on what came before us, being confident in the fact that other people are going to continue this on with even better tools.
I come here a lot. It seems like every time I come here, there's always I always have at least one moment. I guess I'd call them like Arboretum moments. Have you had any of those since you've been here? That moments that you've been like, yes.
Yeah, every day. So I live just outside the Arboretum in the Nakoma neighborhood, so I get to walk to work. And I walk in on paths along the road coming in, and I walk through the Leopold pine, so that, that's part of this big legacy, into the Curtis Prairie. So I think I'm constantly having these Arboretum moments that really have led me to kind of think of this picture of, this big legacy that came before me, and then here we are working now. So it is my Arboretum moments are really recognizing that legacy. And then there are all the little bits and pieces, walking around a bend in the path and seeing a deer standing there and thinking, this is a home for all of these organisms. Seeing the seasons change. I've only been here for 2 seasons, so I can't wait to see them change into two more. And I think so it's just kind of this constant process of things are changing and things are staying the same. And that's kind of it's not really a moment, but it's just something that kind of every day resets in me.
I enjoyed that. I spent a lot of time at the Arboretum, and it was cool to get an even greater appreciation for that place's mission. Love the monarch talk as well. Viewing them while they're wintering in Mexico or California as well is a really cool thing to do. It's kind of magical, actually. Anyways, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.
Banana.